In this video, I'll show you how to change the derailleur cable on your mountain bike. I'll be showing this with Shimano shifters. However, if you have SRAM, the procedure is pretty much the same. It's just a little bit different technique of getting the derailleur cable out of the shifter. When I do this, I'll be changing not only the inner wire, but also the cable housing itself. Changing your inner cable and your housing is probably something you want to do about once a year. If you ride in wetter conditions, maybe more frequently. But the way to tell is if your shifting starts to require more effort. And a lot of times you'll jump on another bike and then go back to the bike that's starting to get rough in the shifting, and you'll just really notice that effort. So if you're requiring more effort to do the shift, it's probably time to go ahead and change both the inner wire and the housing. So to do this, you'll of course need a derailleur inner wire. You'll need the housing. 5 or 6 feet should do. You'll probably have some left over. And you'll need some cable ferrules. So these are the little end caps that go on your cables, and a cable crimp to go on the end of the cable. And you'll need some cable cutters. And if you're going to replace the housing, of course, you got to make sure you get the cable cutters that will cut the housing, not just the inner wire. And you may need some duct tape. You'll probably want to have some light lubricant like Triflow. You'll also need an Allen wrench to get the rear derailleur cable off of the rear derailleur. And finally, for the Shimano shifters, you'll need a Phillips screwdriver. I'll have the bike elevated in my work stand to make this a little bit easier, but you definitely don't need a work stand to do this. You could leave the bike on the ground leaning up against something if you wanted to. The first thing that you want to do is shift all the way down to your hardest gear or smallest cog in the back. Loosen the bolt that holds on the derailleur cable to the derailleur, and it's going to be probably either a 4 or 5 millimeter Allen wrench. And before you do this, go ahead and snap a photo with your phone if you're somewhat new to doing this. That way you know exactly how the rear derailleur cable, or front derailleur if you're doing the front, goes back into the derailleur. So on this Shimano, it comes in kind of on the top of this bolt. So I'm going to take my 4 millimeter Allen wrench and just loosen this up. And remember, we're in the smallest cog, hardest gear, which is going to have pretty much no tension on the cable, so that we can get the derailleur cable through the housing to get the old one out. I'm going to take my cable cutters and just cut right about there. That way we have a nice smooth end so we can pull the cable out through the housing. And I'll just back out the housing out of the rear derailleur to take a little tension off. All right, up at the shifter end, we're going to remove, it's almost like a little rubber screw on the Shimano, and we're going to just take our flat blade screwdriver and twist that out. Put your hand underneath because it'll probably fall out as you do this. There we go. So up at the shifter, just kind of separate the housing from the shifter. That'll give you some space to push the derailleur cable. And you'll see the derailleur cable come out that little hole where we removed that little rubber screw. And you can just go ahead and pull it all the way out. Go ahead and remove the cable ferrules from both ends of the cable. Now it's time to remove the cable housing from the bike and put the new one in. But before I do, let me just talk about routing the cables through the frame. So every frame is different. For instance, this Niner has little rubber plugs that you can remove to easily access the cable housing as it comes through the frame. So on the other side, up by the head tube, this is where it comes out of the frame. And so what I'm going to do, what's easier for this bike, is to remove this rubber plug, kind of pull it out of the frame, and that way I can push it up from the bottom and fish it out as it comes through. Like I said, every bike is different, and so it's just going to depend on what's easier for your bike. Sometimes you can even save your cable ties here if you want to just be able to feed it through. So this bike uses cable ties to hold it to the frame because the cable housing is exterior once it comes out right there on the down tube. However your bike is, you're just going to have to figure out what's the best way to get it through the frame. If it's completely exterior, that's the easiest. Internal routing is a little bit of a hassle at times, but once it's in, it's really nice and clean. So I'm going to push this cable housing out. Now let me also say that this is where duct tape can come into play. So sometimes it's easier to tape the new housing onto the old housing and pull it through the frame. So if you want to do that, like I said, that's a technique that you can use. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but if you have to fish it through the frame, I would go ahead and try that. With the old cable housing out of the bike, take the new one, put it alongside, and we're just going to make the new one the exact same length as the old one, unless of course you feel like you need to add a little bit. And once you get it to the proper length, just take your housing cutters and cut it. Remember the phrase, measure twice, cut once. So I did that. I'm going to check it one more time before I make my cut. All right, my length is good. I'll trim the new housing to be the same length as the old one. Before you put the new housing back on the bike, take a small nail or a pick and just make sure that little sheathing inside is opened up so the inner wire will easily feed through the cable. If it's not, it can be kind of annoying because there's a lot of tension on the inner wire, and sometimes it's hard to even get the inner wire inside the housing in the first place. So make sure that it's opened up and you can see a hole inside the cable housing. So from this bike, like I said, I'm going to start from the bottom and feed the cable housing up, and I'm going to go back through the cable ties that I already have on the bike, and then I'm going to go into the frame and push it up. So this one came through the frame pretty easily, and I like the frames that have the rubber plugs that come out so that you can easily fish the cable out of that window, and then you put the rubber plug back in. Before I finish it up, I just want to mention some of the tricks of the trade of getting cables through frames that will help. Having a flashlight like this that goes onto your head, this is a camping flashlight that you can be hands-free and kind of see cables in the frame as you're looking. And then getting a pick set like this. So this has a little hook, and I really like this. That's what I used on this bike because I could see the cable in the window and I can reach through and just pull it out really easily. So this is a Craftsman pick set. So you can pick these up, no pun intended, to get the cables to the frame. And this one came with a bunch of different ones, little angled ones. Sometimes this one's nice because you can put it in there and twist it, and that way you can grab the cable. So a little patience and you'll get it done. Now that I've got the cable through the frame, I've reinstalled that rubber plug. Put some cable ferrules on both ends of your cable. Slide them on, push them on as hard as you can with your fingers. Sometimes if they're really hard to get on, they'll get fully seated in once you install the cable and shift. Up at your shifter with the ferrule back on the housing, just insert it there. And this barrel adjuster, you want to turn it so that it goes all the way in. So you're basically turning it, if you're facing it from this way, you're turning it clockwise, but turning it all the way in, that will give you a lot of room. Once you get your new inner wire installed and tightened down, you'll have room to back it out as you need to. So I'm going to turn that all the way in until it comes to a stop. Before I put the inner wire into the housing, I'm going to take a little bit of lube, and I like using Tri-Flow. So some people will not lube the cable at all, and it kind of depends sometimes on the housing. So you may want to ask your bike shop when you pick up your cable housing, is this housing designed to have a little bit of lube or no lube at all? If you use lube, don't use anything thick, just use something real thin like Tri-Flow. So what I do is I just put a little bit on my fingers and just run my fingers along the inner wire to get, again, just a real thin coating of Tri-Flow onto the inner wire. Now we're going to feed the inner wire into this hole. And if for some reason it's hard to get the inner wire through that hole, you can just take the housing out of the shifter temporarily as you get it started through this hole. Once it pops through, then you can feed it back into the housing. And you have to look inside, and it's hard to do when I'm doing this through a camera, but if you look inside, you can see a little tiny hole where this inner wire will go into, and this is where it also can help to have a flashlight, but once you spot that, it's very easy to poke it through. Okay, now that I've gotten the inner wire to come out of the shifter, I'll just feed it back into the housing and then push the shifter housing up against the shifter, and you want to just push the cable through and you should see it come out the back. Sometimes as you're pushing the cable through, it'll hit the little cable ferrule here, which is what's happening right now. So what I'm going to do is pull the cable ferrule off. That way I can push the inner wire through, and then I'll put the cable ferrule back on. Push the inner wire in through this little hole on your rear derailleur, and then push the cable housing in to that little hole. Now I'm going to tighten the cable and just give it a real good tug with your fingers. I have it fed back through the proper slot on the rear derailleur. There's a little plate here at the bottom. Sometimes this plate will twist, and you want to align it in the proper position. On the XT rear derailleur, the flat end kind of goes up here at the top, so it runs parallel with the floor. So pull on the derailleur with your other hand, or the cable with your other hand, and then tighten that. And it doesn't have to be crazy tight, but you want to get it pretty snug so it doesn't pull loose when you shift. Before I finalize this, I'm going to shift the chain up to the biggest cog in the back. That'll tighten the inner wire, tighten up your ferrules, and then I'm going to loosen this again, pull it, tighten it one more time. Cut the excess inner wire that's hanging down, and I usually do about 1 inch, maybe a little bit more. Then install your cable crimp. And by the way, most cable cutters will have a little inner mechanism that really crimps those down onto your inner wire. Alright, so that's good. If it's a Shimano shifter, go ahead and reinstall this little rubber screw. I'm not going to go too deeply in how to adjust a rear derailleur in this video. I do have a separate one on how to do that, which I'll link below in the description. But if you pulled the inner wire tight enough when you clamped it onto the rear derailleur, you're pretty much tuned. All you really have to do is back out your barrel adjuster so that when you shift out of that smallest cog, it will jump up into the next cog. Once your rear derailleur is tuned properly, there should not be any hesitation as it jumps from your smallest cog up to the next one and then the next one. Like I said, if there is, just back the barrel adjuster out a little bit more. Shifting on this bike is now much easier than it was before, and you too should notice a pretty good improvement in the ease of shifting after you replace your housing and your inner wire. And by the way, it's worth noting that if you want to just try replacing the inner wire first, that way you don't have to pull the cable housing out of the frame, go ahead and try that. Put the lube on, the Tri-Flow, and that way you can get probably a pretty good improvement in shifting. If it's still kind of rough, then I would go ahead and replace the housing as well. It's been over a year since I've done this housing. That's why I wanted to do the housing and the inner wire. But if you don't want to go through this hassle, replacing just the inner wire is about a 5-minute procedure. So maybe you want to try that first. Any questions or comments about this procedure, drop them below. Thanks for watching.